Oregon's natural history at our family day. And then on Saturday, November 5th, I am excited to tell you that we are having the grand reopening of our museum's Cultural History Exhibit Hall, Oregon, where past is present. We'll have free admission all weekend and a special members-only preview that Friday night. So if you have any questions about these or other upcoming museum programs, we have program guides on the table right outside. Feel free to pick one up on your way out. And now for our panelists. We have Briece Edwards up here in front, Chelsea Rose, Mark Tveskov, and our moderator, Brian O'Neill, here to present Digging into the Recent Past. Briece is the senior archaeologist with the Historic Preservation Department for the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. The tribe's archaeology and research program provides archaeological services and cultural resources training and implements research projects focused on cultural resources. Chelsea is an adjunct faculty member at Southern Oregon University and staff archaeologist for the Southern Oregon University Laboratory of Anthropology. Her research focuses on the early settlement and development of the American West, and she has served as vice president of the Association of Oregon Archaeologists. Mark is a professor of anthropology at Southern Oregon University and the director of the SOU Laboratory of Anthropology. He is also a UO alum. He earned his PhD here in 2000, and in 2014 he was appointed by the governor to the State Advisory Committee on Historic Preservation. And last but not least, our moderator, Brian O'Neill, is a senior archaeologist for the Museum of Natural and Cultural History and the State Museum of Anthropology. He has directed archaeological research throughout Oregon, but the focus of his work has been the interior valleys of the Willamette, Umpqua, and Rogue River drainages. So, we will have brief presentations by our moderator and our panelists, at which point Brian may or may not, depending on timing, pose a couple questions to the panel himself before turning it over to you for your questions. So please join me in welcoming everyone.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you all for being here this evening. It's a real pleasure. I'm, by training, a prehistoric archaeologist, and so this is a little different for me to moderate a historical archaeology panel, but I'm going to give it a go. Oops. One of the things about historic archaeology is, of course, its brief time depth, as opposed to that very long time depth that we're very familiar with when you meet archaeologists from the Museum of Natural and Cultural History. Dennis Jenkins and Tom Connolly talk often about very deep time depth, 14,000, 12,000 years ago, and so on. And I deal particularly with time depths on the order of 10, 11,000 years ago. But historic archaeology here has a couple of centuries in terms of time depth. But one of the things that historic archaeology does have that prehistoric archaeology doesn't have is a great wealth of documentation, a great wealth of artifacts. It has documents in terms of photographs and maps, journal entries, anyway, lots and lots of information. What I would like to do is I'd like to talk very briefly about several projects that the museum has done that have had historic archaeological elements. The first three projects involve archaeological sites, Native American sites, that have also had historic assemblages. Bezuxuas was a small village along the Klamath. Along. Am I?
Yeah.
Am I? Can you hear me without that? No. All right. Bezuxuas was investigated by Dick Cheatham, an archaeologist here at the museum. It was a Klamath village along the Williamson River near Chiloquin, and it was inhabited for some 4,500 years, ending in about 1910. The historic occupation of Bezuxuas began about 1864 with the formation of the Klamath Reservation. Artifacts representing this period include metal, glass, ceramics, leather, beads, buttons, bullets and cartridges, bone, shell, and children's toys. The historic occupation diet included domestic animals and crops, cows, pigs, beans, and Italian plums, which were supplemented by the traditional diet, and also included in the historic assemblage were cans representing lard, baking powder, and other canned goods, reflecting the site's change in diet and their introduction into the cash economy. Another site that we have looked at recently is Beatty Curve in southern Klamath County. The highway bisects the site with deep prehistoric deposits spanning some 8,000 years located at the toe of the hill slope, and the historic occupation situated farther upslope. The investigations of the historic assemblage focused on an 8 by 12 cabin, 8 by 12 foot cabin that was probably built by the Klamath Agency for a chiefly family. It was originally constructed of cut nails but later repaired and modified with wire nails. In addition to abundant food remains, personal items were recovered including children's shoes and marbles, hair combs and buttons, shaving razors and firearms, indicating that it was occupied by a family that included men, women, and children. The bones of both domestic animals and wild game were found, but relatively few saw-cut bones, indicating limited access to commercially processed meats. Also absent were cans and condiment bottles, suggesting a very limited use of commercial food products, unlike Bezuxuas near Chiloquin. Surrounding the cabin were patches of ash, charcoal, and burned earth, possibly where drying racks had been raised, drying racks for fish. The Klamath people living at this site around the turn of the century were transitioning from a traditional way, a life way, to a cash economy. A third site that, again, is a Native American occupation, prehistoric occupation that continues into the historic period, is the Limpy Creek site, one that Mark is absolutely familiar with. Mark and I worked on this site, and we jointly published a monograph. Is that a monograph? Anyway. A duograph. In 1996, museum archaeologists examined a small habitation site along the Rogue River downstream from Grants Pass. The Limpy Creek site was found to contain a house pit and an associated midden. And, there we go. Associated midden and lithic workshop. The base of the midden had an archaeological, or had a radiocarbon date of about 600 years ago, so the site itself wasn't very old. The historic assemblage, however, included glass, metal, lead shot, trade beads, cut nails, an 1838 half dime, a perforated copper plate, a 4-hole button, a ceramic tobacco pipe fragment, hand-painted earthenware fragment, and on one of the projectile points that we collected from the site, there was residue, that is protein, that tested positive for bovine. So apparently the people there were also collecting cattle that were maybe wandering the area during the historic period. Another site of historic importance is Kamwachung. In John Day, the building that housed the Kamwachung Company stands as a museum and interpretive center, providing information about the role of the Chinese immigrant community in the placer mining of gold from Upper John Day River in the 1860s. The building, built in the late 1860s and later bought in 1887 by herbal doctor Ng Doc Hay and his businessman Lung On, served as a living quarters and business location for the two. The various businesses that it housed included a general store, doctor's office, medicinal herb shop, post office, labor contracting office, and temple for the regional Chinese community. Archaeological investigations around the building have uncovered many bones that reflect not only a broad diet of domestic birds and animals, but also the distinctive Chinese butchery method of chopping. These investigations also yield fragments of opium pipes and liquor bottles, glass medicine vials and gaming pieces, and porcelain dishes that reflect the many different community activities centered there. Now, one of the things about historic archaeology is you have a lot of records, you have a lot of documentation. However, documentation doesn't always tell you the complete story. At Kamwachung, there were full liquor bottles that were discovered in sawdust beneath the floorboards, possibly reflecting the participation of those folk in liquor trade during Prohibition. Records wouldn't have been available about that, right? That's why archaeology is good. Museum archaeologist and collections division head Pam Enzweig investigated a late 1800s homestead at Crooked River, southwest of Prineville. Found within and beyond the house foundations, the artifact assemblage suggests a rather prosperous homesteading family and included cut nails, window glass, iron stove and wagon parts, fragments of a child's writing slate and lead pencil, fragments of porcelain doll's head, dinnerware fragments, glass jars, lamp chimneys, tin cans, clothing buttons, shoe fragments, combs, so on. Rifle and pistol cartridge casings in a variety of calibers. The animal bones found at the site point to a household economy primarily based on stock raising, horse, cow, sheep, pig, chicken, but supplemented by hunting and fishing. Deer and jackrabbit bones were found there, as well as fish bones. An 1893 photo, doesn't show up very well, sorry about that, of the area shows a single-family board and batten house. Oops, did I turn something off?
No?
What are you doing? Huh? Am I still connected?
It's showing.
Where am I? Let me... Okay, so I can go forward from here. What's going on? Oh, it's a Mac. I see. Okay. Anyway.
All right.
Let's not. Okay.
Let's skip the last site.
Okay. Well, anyway, we have the museum did some work at the Sayusla River Bridge in Florence, recording or documenting a series of pilings, and these pilings were associated with salmon cannery. They were associated with a slipway. They were associated with ferry landings as well as pilings that were used in the 1934 through 1936 building of the Sayusla River Bridge at Florence. Anyway, this was just our documentation of that.
You're
that's...
running out of time, right?
What's that? I'm running out of time? I'm running out of time? Okay. Okay. Why don't I just call it good then? Huh?
Show Harris.
No?
Is there one more that you really want to touch on? Harris Homestead?
Let's go to... well, we can talk about Harris Homestead. Okay. We'll talk about Harris Homestead, and we'll call it good. Because this will transition. In 2010, the museum archaeologists examined the George and Mary Harris donation land claim and homestead north of Grants Pass, which was established in 1854-55. The historic Willamette Valley to Jacksonville Wagon Road crossed near the Harris cabin, perhaps in the same general route as Applegate Trail. The Harris homestead was the location of a famous Indian attack during the 1855 Rogue Indian War, part of a larger response to an unprovoked attack by whites on a native encampment, and it's considered by historians as the trigger to open war. The cabin was subsequently burned and its location lost. The museum's efforts rediscovered the location and gathered sufficient information that it will soon become the focus of a SULA project. Thank you very much.
This is like archaeological speed dating.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm going to try and whiz through a whole bunch of background about kind of tribes and a perspective on archaeology, and then hit on a couple of points about specifically historic era significance for tribes. So with that, let's hope I can find the right button. And so, and that's actually a very old slide. The tribe, Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, we take stewardship responsibility for actions in consideration for the cultural resources within the tribe's ceded land. So, who's not familiar with the term ceded lands? Excellent. If you've had anybody else from the Historic Preservation Office, you've also seen that image. That's the stewardship area. It's comprised of those individual treaty areas that you see on the right side. The composite of that area is what you see outlined there. In essence, crest of the Coast Range, crest of the Cascades, north shore of the Columbia to California. 14 million acres. And what's fascinating about that is it has all of that time depth that we've heard so far. So that, there is the physical evidence, but there's also the oral tradition evidence of that time depth going back to the Briece and Missoula floods in the Willamette Valley, 14,500 years ago. So what we do in our office is we deal with collections, archaeology and research, cultural preservation, and projects. So I'm getting a little bit away from the traditional archae, but this is my hope to help understand the perspective that tribes have in looking at cultural resources or archaeology. We look at it as evidence and belongings of people and through time, but also through that stewardship responsibility in looking at how do we review permits to go forward under the state and federal laws here in Oregon. So we're looking at materials, we're also looking at legal processes and how we review for research design. How do we develop partnerships so that our staff can provide informed comment for that entire area. So these are some of the things that we deal with. What we also deal with are these tangible, intangible, the crossed resources. So tangibles are quite easy, but those intangible and crossed resources have a direct bearing with the historical period. Those are those bits of evidence that add depth and provide direct connection between tribal activities in a time period that oftentimes tribal indigenous engagement is not considered. For example, when the Willamette locks are being constructed, the majority of the workforce is actually Native American. When the locks are being dug, they encounter a stone effigy, and everybody on the work crew, the tribal portion of that crew, identifies with what that object is representing and walk off. So there's an absolute, stoppage. There's a halting in this major undertaking. And today, when people talk and look and engage with consideration of the Willamette locks, the tribal component tends to get spent out over looking at the rock carvings and the village sites there, not the actual construction that led to the economic growth of that location. So, and it's because we have those oral traditions that survive. It's not 14,000 years old. It's only 150 years old. The other thing is that for Grand Ronde, and different for all tribes, for Grand Ronde, we tend to take an approach of looking at practice first through time, all the way up to the present. We also look at these different time periods. We talk about the modern period and historic and prehistoric. But if we were to look at this, we tend to think modern, we have a full grasp. It's tangible. We can fully engage with it in that first-person experience. So we've got a greater sense of confidence and reliability in our understanding. We push time back a little bit, and it gets a little bit foggy. We start looking at historic sources with greater scrutiny. We tend to go, well, that newspaper was in that, or that article in that newspaper, so maybe there's a skewed journalistic bias, or diaries, all of that. So, but we also have this econom time, which is for Grand Ronde tribes, that time before. It's that myth age, and that's when those practices are being set out. That's when the definition of place is being laid out. And once you have an understanding of that definition, it helps to provide an understanding of why we find residences where we do, even in the historic period. So today we do all sorts of different project work. One of them is ethnobotanical surveys. And what we found is using the GLO maps and soils maps, we can go out and find these ancient or even historic gathering sites. This is Wapato and Camas, everybody's familiar with those. The GLO maps help us to understand and bridge through that contact period, or from historic backwards, where we can look at a landscape in the surveyor's notes talking about hazel and vine maple and fern and cedars, and you look at that mix and go, those don't belong together. That's a likely managed landscape. And if that's what's being recorded in 1854 on a map, we can start to understand what it was prior to that. To have that still survive in 1854, we know that, if it's describing a cedar that's got a DBH of about 3 feet, well, that's an old tree. And management practices that are being conveyed up through that historic period. Cultural landscapes. That's a little faded, but places out on the Oregon coast that are historic and prehistoric and ongoing activity areas, and looking at how people continue those practices. Back to that, understanding the practice helps us to understand the place. We also have been looking at stories and placing those stories back on a very ancient landscape. And you might ask the question of what's the relevance of that in a historical context? Well, the relevance of that is we can look at resilience. We can look at population adaptation to climate change in very distant antiquity, but we can also bring that up to the change in agricultural practice and loss of gathering areas, and how did the tribal groups, the tribes, adapt to those changes by loss. And what we're finding is the practices of kind of maximized return on smaller landscapes on the reservation is emerging. So, cultural impacts. One of the things that we've been doing also is we've been looking at, on the Grand Ronde Reservation alone, I'm going to try and keep this short, We've partnered with UW, and I know that's not the right thing to say here, especially with the game tomorrow. But looking at both the 1856 relocation of tribes to, from 14 million acres to 69,000 acres. And what's the distribution? Is there a cultural pattern of assemblage? We have a Kalapuya encampment. Is there a material culture that we can say is Kalapuyan in contrast to Malala or Sandiam or Chinook? So that's one of the questions that we've been looking at. We've also been looking at the issue of schools. Tribes and schools have a very long and very complicated history. At Grand Ronde, we've got no fewer than 7 schools, ranging from Catholic to agency to other. And we've been excavating at the agency school now for 2 years. And next year I hope to move over to the location of the Catholic school. And then 2 years down the road we'll be at one of the earlier schools where we can start to look at not just education, but children. Because children are that continuation of generations, that kind of segue from elder to the future. And so far what we're finding is all the things that you would expect at a school. We've got slate, we've got pencil nubs down to less than an inch in length. We've got chew marks on pencils. I should point out that we found the privy, one of the privies at the school. And so we've got a wonderful context of material. And it's one of those opportunities to look at a period that tribal members have immediate understanding, as well as their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents who were members or students at these schools. In some cases, they then became the principal or the teacher at the school. So it's a different narrative, a different understanding of education, agency schools, and tribal community. So with that, I've hit a very broad topic of some of the things that we've been involved in.
Hi. Oh, this is smooth. I wanted to just start off by saying I'm also a U of O grad, and the reason I mention that is because I wouldn't be where I am today without the wonderful mentors like Brian and Tom Connolly and the other U of O museum staff. So it's always great to come home. So on that note, I'm going to another whirlwind talk through some of the work we've been doing the past several years with the Chinese immigrant diaspora across Southern Oregon, mostly focused on our work in Jacksonville. So let's see. Start off with the obligatory map, which now that it's that big, I don't even know if the star's in the right place, but it's south, almost to California. And if you haven't been there before, it's a wonderful place, so you should go visit. Okay, so Jacksonville is a historic town that's on the National Register, one of the first national historic districts on the West Coast. It's a really great place to work and live. And one of the things that makes it interesting for archaeologists is, number one, there hasn't been a lot of big machinery through there since most of the buildings are the same that have been there for well over 100 years. But the other interesting aspect is it kind of presents itself like this frozen in amber 19th century landscape. And it's really important. Archaeology does a good job at pointing out that there's key aspects of that landscape missing. It's a political landscape. And so, for example, the bustling neighborhood of the Chinese Quarter is not there at all. So our job as archaeologists has been to bring it back to life to the extent that we can. The archaeological component was first encountered well over a decade ago by U of O archaeologists as part of a road improvements. And our work in the last couple years has also been funded by ODOT in the city of Jacksonville, but for sidewalks. So they were trying to connect the Old Town with the Brit Music Festival. They were going right through the Chinese Quarter, and they couldn't avoid it, so we came in to do an excavation. And part of our larger research questions were looking at what was it like to be a resident in the Chinese Quarter during the 19th century, and also to kind of tease apart some of the stereotypes about Chinese immigrants in general. One of the things that I love about this time period, but it also provides a lot of juicy research questions, is looking at these myths of the West, the Wild West. And so the Chinese population is a really good example of that because they've been absolutely stereotyped. People have focused, and to some extent still do, on the exotic aspects of the culture. A lot of archaeology has gotten really fascinated with the dishes that are really fancy and stuff like that, and kind of ignored some of the more, seemingly mundane aspects of what was it like to be a Chinese individual in Jacksonville in the 1880s. The other thing that kind of is misrepresented is the population is kind of presented as this monolithic population. Because a lot of them did come from southern China. However, there is a lot of diversity within that group, including different languages and kinship groups, and so it's not a homogeneous population. So those are kind of some of the research questions we went into looking at. And also, how permeable was this neighborhood? Chinatowns are kind of thought of as like this separate thing where nobody goes in or out really. And in Jacksonville, it's a small town, so there's, of course, a lot more interaction beyond this one city block. Here is the main part of Jacksonville. Does this have a light? Well, anyways, you can see it. Oh, it is. Okay. I'm often accused of going like this, so I'm going to try to slowly circle it. There you go. So I don't make anybody hypnotized. But okay, so here is the Chinese Quarter during the 1880s. This map is actually 1 month before the fire that I'm going to talk about that burned down the site, and these are just a few of the photos of the people that lived in the neighborhood. I like to try to make a point, and it's kind of a challenge to myself, to keep a focus on the individuals, on the people that were in the neighborhood, instead of just talking about like one just big population, but to give them faces and names. And this gentleman here was a neighbor of the house that I'm going to talk about. His name is Lim Wang. He was a laundryman that lived in Jacksonville for a long time, had a business in a few different areas across town. And one of the reasons I point that out is this is an old man, and he lived in this community for like 30 years. So that's not a fresh off the boat Chinese immigrant, which is what the stereotype presents. This is a Chinese American who has lived here, made his home, put down roots. And so those are kind of some of the things that we're trying to help fill out the historiography of this population, and give a more nuanced account of what life was like. Go back. This is another famous guy, Toy Key, and I love, this is one of the earliest Peter Britt photos. This is like actually a daguerreotype, I think. And it's a Chinese miner, and I don't know what he's doing with his hand, but it's like he's got like some kind of cool sign he's flashing there, so I think that's a pretty cool photo, but I don't know his name. This is a picture of Jacksonville zoomed in. This is a bird's eye map from 1883, and it's a lovely picture of Jacksonville. It kind of looks blurry to me. I apologize if it's blurry to you guys. But what's interesting is the Chinese Quarter has been literally and figuratively whitewashed. These houses are all lovely little nice houses on a block, which in other maps they're kind of described more as shanties. So it's a kind of a romanticized view of Jacksonville in general, but it does have some good information about our project area. And this is the dramatic drum roll. On Tuesday morning, September 11th at 3 a.m. of 1888, a fire breaks out in the Lynn Furniture Mill. And it's arson, a spiteful incendiary device. That's what the newspapers always say. I don't know if that's like a Molotov cocktail or something, but somebody bought a bad chair or something because they burned the mill down. And one of the interesting things is during this time period, the 1880s, this is the height of the Chinese exclusion era. And a lot of people have kind of assumed that Jacksonville burned by arson, targeting the community. And that's not true. But it's still a political event because the fire department dedicates their limited resources towards saving the town and the Chinese Quarter. The buildings are really dilapidated because the residents aren't allowed to own buildings. They're de-incentivized from starting businesses because they have like a $50 a month tax. So all these reasons contribute to this part of the neighborhood being very vulnerable to fire. So, there's a close-up of the building that we excavated, which funnily enough, is that even a word? Oddly enough, in 2008, another dig with the U of O did some holes kind of down the hill a little bit, and I think we found the back side of this building or part of it, which was kind of fun to get another side of it. So here is not a great graphic, but showing this is the Sanborn map showing two different illustrations of our building, very different. These were made for fire insurance purposes, so they probably thought these people are never going to get fire insurance, just sketch it, whereas these are all like totally to scale. So unfortunately, we don't have good, accurate illustrations. I'm doing it. Slow down with the red light. Sorry. Here is our excavation, and it looks like a really odd design because we were avoiding like power and plants, and so it just kind of ended up like that. But it's really fortuitous because we ended up in a doorway of this building. Ignore the blue line, I think that's too big. But basically you get the picture of where we are in that house over there. And that's really exciting because we know where the Chinese Quarter is in town. We know what house we are on the map. And now we know where our excavations are in the house. So we can start to really get into detail about what we found, including the building itself was perfectly preserved, and when I say that, that's to an archaeologist, so of course it's ruins, but everything was where it was when the house burned, so that's exciting. To me, that's good enough. And we were able to use fire science to kind of help rebuild the furniture and reimagine how the house was by how the fire was affected by the furniture in the house and some of the other considerations. So you can see we started to put some activity areas in place. In this area that we were just kind of calling the pantry, we could tell that artifacts were on shelves because they were kind of in horizons. We had dense shelving units worth of these kind of storage jars that had soy sauce or fish oil. We have other containers that would have had dried, pickled, preserved foods that would have come in from China. We have personal items like toothbrushes, medicine vials, these things. We have tableware, teapots, cups, saucers, rice bowls, spoons. So we have a lot of, the daily life of the people living inside this house. And one of the things I like to point out is even though this suite of artifacts is pretty distinct to the Chinese immigrant population, this is a lot of the same kind of stuff that's found in Chinese sites across the West. And even though these items would have been familiar to somebody living in southern China or Jacksonville in this neighborhood, it does not mean they were presented or experienced in the same way. In addition to traditional Chinese food and serving vessels, we also found Worcestershire sauce and pepper sauce and some other American condiments. And a lot of the folks living in this neighborhood were employed as cooks or domestic servants, or so there's definitely a lot of cross-cultural interaction. Here's some of the food stuff we found. And we found, this is my favorite thing. This is a wok that was in situ in this kitchen area on some unmortared bricks, kind of in a circle. And this is a traditional cooking technique that's still used in parts of southern China today because it's a really great way to cook something. You don't need a lot of fuel for the fire. You can make a quick hot fire to cook your food. And again, this is September, so it's hot in Jacksonville. It could be 90s plus. So whether or not this was a year-round cooking technique or not, it was certainly a great way to cook food during this time of year. Here is a cleaver. And here's some of the faunal fragments we found. We have fish, poultry, pork, beef, mutton. I think there's even some deer. And a lot of the food has been chopped, like with the cleaver. And I'm not the faunal person, so I can't go too much into detail. But over 50 pounds of bones. Then we also have a huge botanical assemblage, and we had a specialist at Boston look at that. We have Szechuan peppercorn, lychee nuts. What did I say?
Boston what?
Oh, UMass Boston. We have lychee nuts, peanuts, different foods that would have come over from China or could have been purchased from regional or local markets. So we have a lot of ideas of what kind of stuff was being cooked in the house. We also have a section of the house that's like the rumpus room, the gaming corner, you know. We got a lot of, and everything kind of, this traditional suite of gaming stuff came from this area. And a lot of it was really heat altered because the fire got really hot in that part of the house because it was really open, and so it had a lot of oxygen. So that was another kind of fun fact about that, including this stack of melted quarters, which was pretty neat. And then, because I think I'm almost out of time probably.
That clock messed up.
Okay.
It's 6:12, so, but, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, anyways, so I just wanted to kind of show you where we're going next with this project. So we are putting together a digital comparative collection that's going to be hosted on the SOU website. It's a partnership with the Library Special Collections. So pretty soon you will be able to go and look up different artifacts that are popular or commonly found on Chinese archaeological sites in the West, and learn about correct terminology, how we're going to have parts of vessels and whole things so you can try to figure out what something was, traditional uses. And this is all to kind of dispel some of those myths about what things were. Almost everything everybody thought was opium related, and of course it wasn't all. So we can get at some of those kind of myths, but also help standardize terminology and also help people figure out what they have and what it might mean to the population at the time. So.
All right. Can you hear me? Okay. Can you stand one more? So I'm Mark Tveskov, and I'm going to talk about our Southern Oregon University's research into the Rogue River Indian War. And this is a project that in some ways goes back to my time. I'm also an alum of the University of Oregon. And when me, Ryan and I worked on the Limpy Creek site and some of my dissertation research on the coast. And that spurred my interest in colonialism generally. And when I got my job at Southern Oregon University, one thing led to the other, and I started to work on these sites dating to the 1850s from the Rogue River Indian Wars. At that time, in the 1990s, there wasn't a lot of historical archaeology going on in the state of Oregon, and that Limpy Creek site was kind of an interesting one. And we're putting this 10-minute presentation together, and that clock was freaking me out. It was like, it was like spinning around the dial. But trying to put this in a 10-minute presentation, what occurred to me was how far we've come in historical archaeology collectively, in the sense that we have longitudinal data now. Like for prehistoric archaeologists, you can look at projectile points and compare them across many sites. And now we're not just looking at a single incidence of an archaeological site from the historic era, and now we're able to compare across sites. So the archaeology of the Rogue River War, as it's developed since the mid-1990s, historical archaeology is traditionally characterized as in contrast to prehistoric archaeology, and it has sometimes, I think, a bad rap as being the quote-unquote handmaiden to history, and it's like, let's find George Washington's teeth or something. And I think that more productively, in the way we've approached it at Southern Oregon University, is to think about it as the archaeology of colonialism, of the colonial era, of the European diaspora across the rest of the globe, and then find little incidences of that and think about them. And in that sense, here in Oregon, for the Rogue River Wars of the 1850s, how we've thought about it, and along a couple of different research questions, including myth busting, for example, and this is something similar to the Chinese archaeology of a kind of the way that at the turn of the century, the Rogue River War was almost literally whitewashed in the myth-making of the Oregon Territory to create this kind of monolithic story of the frontier process, when it was really a much more convoluted, messy, and diverse ethnically and in terms of gender and a bunch of other things, and to use archaeology and primary document research to tease that out. Simultaneous with that across the world, in the United States in particular, battlefield archaeology has become more popular, if that's the right word. And one of our partners, John Craig, worked on the Custer battlefield, and that sort of set a standard for doing the forensic archaeology of battlefields, which got a lot of us archaeologists very interested. And we've sort of tried to incorporate that as well. And then finally, and perhaps not the least of which, is as a public university, as a Southern Oregon University, we've tried to approach our archaeology to add value to the public dollar in terms of how we're spending taxpayer money, how we're being responsive to local communities, regional communities, and trying to make our research not just satisfy some academic question, but also to engage local communities like Jacksonville or Gold Beach or wherever we might find them, and help them think about place, the archaeology of place. So in that light as well, we always try to build bridges and partnerships, and this is a list of the many partners we've had in this Rogue River research over time. That's a photograph of one of our field school participants this past summer at Miners Fort. But the many sites we've excavated in the Rogue River War have included partners from the Oregon Department of Transportation. That's how we first got into the Fort Lane site as a mitigation project. And then OPRD, the Oregon Parks Department, up to and including our summer field school this past year at Miners Fort in Curry County and the Geisel Homestead, but also Siriaden and Fort Lane, the Southern Oregon Historical Society, the Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, and most recently, the National Park Service. They have a grant program, the American Battlefield Protection Program, that was originally designed because the federal government, your tax dollars, had to pay some ungodly amount to preserve part of the Manassas battlefield back east to save it from development from a shopping mall. And Congress, in all of its wisdom, decided they should start to have a pot of money every year to proactively preserve battlefields. And little old Oregon has been able to leverage that, and we received one of these National Park Service grants to create a national register nomination, a multiple property nomination for the Rogue River Wars, and that's a project that we're still working on, funded by the National Park Service. And another aspect of our Rogue River War research, as I alluded to, is public engagement, regional partnership, and SULA has worked hard on that to some extent by working with our tribal partners like Briece and the Grand Ronde tribe and the other Western Oregon fairly recognized tribes, and to engage students in the form of a Southern Oregon University field school and the local community. That picture in the upper right was taken by a fellow who lived right next to the Miners Fort site, who was a professional photographer, and he was very much engaged with the process and took some nice pictures. We also deliberately, in the Chinese Quarter Archaeology and in the Rogue River War Archaeology, host public days and public presentations. When we were in Gold Beach this past summer, we had a weekly lecture series, and that's Patty Whereat from the Confederated Tribes of Coos-Lorenquas Sayuslaw talking about her new publication on local ethnobotany. And these public days and public presentations were successful beyond what we anticipated. Over 100 people attended each of our public days, and there was hundreds of people, I don't know the exact number, but there was many people that would attend the lecture in Gold Beach, a small beach community in Southern Oregon, as a way to, once again, add value, not just to make it like an academic exercise, but also answer the public's question and involve them as much as possible. And then, of course, social media. We made a deliberate effort in this research to present what we're doing on an almost daily basis via Facebook and other social media. And once again, it seemed to be very successful. We'd post a short video about a discovery in the field, and it would get over 1,000 views within 24 hours. So trying to bring that archaeology to the public, who, after all, are paying for this with their tax dollars in one way or the other. So I'll try to keep up with the speeding clock. I just have a quick images of some of the sites. The Rogue River Wars were the 1850s, part of the gold rush. Compared to the Willamette Valley, Southern Oregon was not settled by Euro-Americans until the gold rush. And overnight, the Takelma, Cow Creek, Shasta, Tututni people suddenly found themselves with a bunch of neighbors who were out to mine gold. Conflict was almost immediate. There was a couple attempts at treaty signing, and it failed. And in the year 1855-56, violence erupted for the final time, basically an all-out war that resolved in 1856 when most Native American people in Southern Oregon were removed to the Grand Ronde and Siletz Reservation. That's a 30-second summary of the war. And we've tried to find properties relating to that war and opportunities to look at them for a variety of reasons through archaeology. Fort Lane was the first, and I've spoken here before about Fort Lane, and we did a lot of excavation there. It's now a part of the state park system, and that's the excavations at the enlisted men's barracks and some artifacts. And once again, in terms of this longitudinal study, we were able to compare the enlisted men's barracks to the officers' barracks, where the officers had French perfume and the enlisted men had beef marrow hair pomade. It's like my favorite story from Fort Lane. Seriatin is another state parks project near Port Orford. This is a very interesting site. You know, in archaeology today, we think about the archaeology of place and how people think about place over the long term. There at the mouth of Garrison Lake on the Pacific coast, there's over 5,000 years of Native American occupation. It's a continuous occupation, a series of projectile points leading right up into the contact period in the Rogue River War era, when the site was used as a concentration camp when captive Native people from the Rogue River Wars were corralled there prior to their removal to the Grand Ronde and Siletz Reservation. And our excavations for state parks uncovered at least a fragment of that in the form of trade beads and that face pipe featuring Queen Victoria. And this class of artifacts, these clay pipes, are one of these kinds of artifacts that we're now starting to develop big databases for that we compare across sites. And that's Queen Victoria right there. Another project we worked on was the Camp Castaway, the site of the wreck of the Captain Lincoln. This was a government schooner that transported the soldiers of the United States Army to Oregon to fight the Rogue River War. And that site in the sand dunes on the north spit of Coos Bay, I never did a shipwreck site before. That was kind of fun. And we found parts of the ship, copper ship spikes, and the copper nails in the wooden elements, architectural elements of the ship itself, and the ferrous metal, those are barrel hoops. That particular one was preserved in situ as we excavated it and left it there, and it was basically a shadow of rust in sand. It didn't come out of the ground beyond that. It was just preserved in situ like that. The actual Captain Lincoln, this was in 1852, by the way, was a 3-masted schooner. That's a similar U.S. government transport ship. We don't have an actual picture of the Captain Lincoln. Another one of our biggest projects emerged out of the Fort Lane, and that was the discovery and analysis of the Battle of Hungry Hill that took place on October 31st, 1855. This was in Josephine County, and we looked really hard for this site. It had gotten lost. And one of the reasons it was lost was that the combined forces of citizen volunteers and United States Army Dragoons basically got their butts kicked by a force half their size of Native Americans led by a woman named Queen Mary, who was in the command of the Native American forces. And they basically decided they didn't want anyone to remember that, and they told the story first like, well, we kind of won the battle, but we didn't really win the battle, and then they lost it all together entirely. Once again, John Craig, who's here, was the first one to find some artifacts from that battlefield after a 2 or 3 year search. And we later on, with the Bureau of Land Management, were able to do a forensic analysis of the battlefield and trace its course over the course of 2 days. And that was a battle that marked the opening of the Rogue River War of 1855. And some of our GIS-derived maps, this is a part of a series that recreates the battle over time. We've also looked at some of the collateral damage of the Rogue River War. This past summer with state parks, we excavated at the Geisel homestead, and the Geisels were a German immigrant family in Curry County who, in the Rogue River War, when it reached Curry County, were attacked by the Tututni Indians, and Mr. Geisel and his sons were murdered in front of the women of the house, and Christina Geisel and her daughters were kidnapped by the Native Americans at the time. And their memorial, and one of our sort of mythological themes, like in terms of territorial origin tales, is today it's a state park with a monument honoring the Geisels. And we did some excavation here and found trade beads and other domestic artifacts. We haven't photographed these artifacts just yet. That's Christina Geisel, much later in her life. And this was a brand new pioneer gold rush homestead. And the way this story is told is interesting mythologically because it sort of represents the ordeal that pioneers went through, represented by the women. And this is an old literary tale told in the United States. It's called a captivity narrative. And the literary nature of the story goes beyond the actual facts of the case. And that's one of the themes that we're thinking about for the Rogue River War. And then Miners Fort was a project we did this summer, and it was a pioneer fort from the Rogue River War. And I'm not sure how am I doing time-wise. 1 minute. Oh, my God. All right, really fast. Well, one of the great things, Miners Fort was a good one for remote sensing, and working with Briece and also Archaeophysics out of Minneapolis, we did LIDAR, ground penetrating radar, electrical resistivity, and magnetometer with spectacular results. Here's an air photo from 1939 showing the fort and its bastions, a LIDAR photo from 2015 where you can still see it. This is the magnetometer, registers magnetic anomalies under the ground, and the resistivity survey that tracks it. And we went out there this summer and excavated it, and these are scenes from the field school. That's another one of these mysterious face pipes, and we think it's a effigy of one of our field workers. And that's Millard Fillmore right there. And then these are the architectural remains of some of the buildings. I'm kind of rushing here, but we identified many of the internal features of the cabins at the fort during the summer. That's Courtney, one of our field school students. And I am going to show this video of the completion of our excavation. It's pretty short. And we were able, through our archaeological excavations, once again, to go into some of these internal buildings inside the fort there. And can you pause it when I say it? I'll show you.
This is a drone, by the way.
Yeah, this is drone footage. The local Gold Beach Police Department did this for us, and it was really nice of them. So there's the north cabin in the site, the south cabin, right? Stop! Oh, too bad. Anyway, that drone footage captures, like, you could see the outlines of the buildings and such, and that was the remote sensing in that site really did well. These are students trying desperately to form SOU with their bodies. Okay, all right, next slide. Okay, and then the last site, and two more sites really quickly. The Harris Homestead, this is what Brian was talking about. The U of O did some work here, and we're going to go back and excavate it more. And this is an image of the attack on the Harris Homestead that once again matches these like captivity narratives from the 17th century back in New England. And the way those stories are told are perfectly analogous to those. And then finally, a project we're going to be working on. This was the major battle that ended the Rogue River War, the Battle of Big Bend. And we're going to be going out there relatively soon and try to recreate what we did at Hungry Hill in terms of a GIS and forensic analysis of that battlefield. Okay, and I think that's probably out of time. Rushed at the end.
Now I tell you to cook in my neck.
Good job, guys. Good job.
I'd like to invite you all to ask questions. Have you got some questions? There we go. Please.
I find it really exciting that there's so much effort made by all three of you to connect the communities around you. It brings much information to them as well as using the modern media. I just think that that's so important to get people vested in this and to see it as their history, whether it's a Native American history or a colonial or European history. And I wondered about efforts. You mentioned different field schools. You seem to have both the indigenous Native Americans involved in this as well as other school groups, and you're also obviously having archaeology students as well as others. So the outreach to involve younger people in this process is pretty impressive.
Well, every one of my projects there was on public property except one. That miners' fort was on private property, and we were lucky to have earned the trust of the private property owner. And once we started going, I mean, I think there was a little bit of, not distrust, but like we were looking at each other at the beginning, but by making that extra effort to involve the community and invite people out there and get people involved, I think it really worked out well in the end. And they did engage it, both the private property owner and the Gold Beach community. I mean, people came out of the woodwork and brought us artifacts that had been collected at the site. There was a woman in Gold Beach who, they used to have picnics on the site to commemorate. It meant like there was still this memory of this place as being important. And people brought us like newspaper articles of, there was a woman who lived to be 100, right? And she baked cakes in the shape of Miners' Fort. And like, so we have that, and that's going to be part of the story we tell about that.
We did not get a cake, though.
We
tried. One other thing that I'll add, too, and then I'm sure you have something to say to this, too. In Jacksonville, and we're starting to get into this phase with the Gold Beach work, in Jacksonville, we had such a great public response, and in a community that really needs to kind of get to know their archaeology because it's all around them, and it's a constant struggle for infrastructure improvements and stuff. I really wanted to make sure that it wasn't like, we're done digging, see ya. So we've been trying to figure out different ways to kind of stay present in the community and keep that looking over the shoulder kind of thing going. So we've had now for a year and a half, we've had a monthly column in the local paper that's either written by one of us or students, ideally, or community members that highlights an artifact or something we figured out about one of the excavations in town. We've also started, Mark and I just started, we have a monthly spot on a local radio program that's in the state of Jefferson, so Southern Oregon, Northern California. And that's another way that, so we're always looking for ways to not only include people during the excavation part, but to follow through to make sure that they realize that it's a much larger process and they feel invested in the result as well, not just the fun part. It's not too hard to convince anyone that a dig's awesome, because it's pretty exciting. So, but the other part that's more mysterious and not always as transparent, that's where we're trying to figure out ways to continue that engagement.
So I have the advantage of this site is just down the road from the office. And it's on tribal land with housing not far away. But if we had a hurdle, it was actually archaeology and tribal community has got a lot of baggage that it carries with it. And so we spent a lot of time with how do we unpackage some of that, how do we leave some of the baggage at the airport, that sort of thing. And that's where the field school actually came in, because we had tribal members participating in that. And so we let it develop in a very organic manner. And because of that, the field school was invited to events at the Plank House. It built and trust and did a lot for demystifying what this action, this avenue of investigation is, and more importantly, what you can do with it as a way of understanding a point in the past.
There was another question over here, wasn't there? Yes.
Several of you talked about the recent evolution of historical archaeology, where initially, like it was mainly just like myths, and there wasn't as much interest, and then like it slowly started building, and now you're getting more funding, you're starting like social media campaigns, and you're trying to like debunk a lot of these myths. Where do you see it going in the future?
Wow, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, we're thinking, I can only speak to what, projects I've been thinking about is we're trying to go towards more and more an open source model. So in addition to, showing stuff on Facebook, that's kind of fun. But the bigger message is getting the information out there and not like hiding it like you're precious. And there's reasons why people tend to kind of guard some of the findings, but usually our findings aren't very controversial, so we don't, we can just say, wow, we found this awesome face pipe, isn't that cool? And we're also doing more and more digital collections like that one I showed you. That's another way that we're trying to kind of share and help let as many people as possible know what we're thinking about and how we're thinking about stuff. And also, one of the really cool things about these open source collections is there's a spot where you can write in and be like, actually, that is not that, it's this. So you can also weigh in, and it can be like a recursive process, and they're living collections, so they can continue to evolve over time. So that's kind of the stuff I'm thinking about going forward. But I don't know, you guys might have other thoughts.
Well, open source is the word, and to illustrate that example is that Battle of Hungry Hill project could only have operated if people were sharing information in a way that they didn't share information 20 years ago. So the model of the archaeologist or the historian as a gatekeeper of information, and now like the primary documents, the diaries and army journals and whatnot, project participants are digitizing those, and those are publicly available online easily. You can find them tomorrow. And the success of the Hungry Hill project was due to the fact that we were all able to read that stuff and talk about it and bring it all to the table, rather than pursue it in a sort of exclusive kind of way.
So, along those lines, we've taken the approach of we've developed a collector app, and so it's actually had a knock-on effect that I'll get to. But by developing the collector app, people can put down their comments, or if they find something, they can take a photo. It'll be geotagged, so then it comes directly into our office. Now, the nice thing that's emerged out of this is we have youngers and elders now communicating. So we're bridging a generation through a technology. So it's been a brilliant knock-on effect.
Yeah, and another example of like how, the end product is not just the academic statement or some grand statement about the past. It's the community building in the act of doing the archaeology or the history or a talk like this. And one other quick example is the remote sensing we did at the Miners Fort site identified these pins, like surveyor markers in the corners of the fort that a surveyor in the 1970s had marked. And we recognized that in the ground penetrating radar signal. And when we excavated, we found these copper surveyor markers in each corner. And on the Facebook discussion of our ongoing excavation, someone came in and said, "Hey, my boss put pins in the corners of that fort in 1974." And we were able to respond in real time. Yeah, we found them, and post a picture of these pins that were 6 inches under the ground that this other person who in the 1970s was very interested in the local history down there, and we were able to use those to continue to build the story. And once again, it's like an example of community building, and those people were really happy to see that come to fruition like 30 or 40 years later, whatever it was.
And to feel they had a stake in it.
And that they had a stake in it, yeah.
But we're also in an exciting time where it's more collaborative. Like we, in Oregon, have wonderful colleagues that we get to work with, and everybody likes to share, information, and, we work on a lot of projects together, and when possible. So that's another way that I think it's changing a little bit.
One more question, please. Yes.
Why do you suppose nobody built houses on the sites? And also, what happened to the Chinese people that had lived there?
Mm-hmm. Two great questions. The first one, why was nothing built over the site? That is because 1888 is 1 year after the railroad rudely went to Medford instead of Jacksonville. And so Jacksonville begins a pretty rapid decline phase. And the reason why we have this beautiful historic landmark is because it was preservation through neglect. They didn't build anything after that. So this block, after that, those houses were burned, they put in fill, like 4 feet of fill, and they extended a roadway. And literally no buildings were ever put there since. So it was just capped, and we were the first people to open it, which was great. The second question, what happened to the population? Well, because of this decline, and because a lot of folks in Jacksonville in general were there because of mining, and the town was shifting towards agriculture, which was not in Jacksonville, which is in the mountains, there was already kind of a drain, but it was compounded for the Chinese population because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which passed in 1882 and ramped up over the years and had a huge impact on who could come into the United States. Could you bring your family here? It got to the point where you had to have a certificate of identification on you at all times, and it really impacted everything you could do. But more importantly, it basically sanctioned racial violence towards the population. So a lot of people left Jacksonville because there wasn't the same kind of jobs, but they moved to larger urban centers. Where we do find a lot of people in Southern Oregon, the Chinese population kind of shifted to Ashland because there was a lot of work in the railroads. And one of the things that's fascinating, this is a little longer, but it's so interesting, is that we do have a lot of folks working in the railroads and continuing to work in the railroads after they're constructed. And most people kind of think about the story of the Chinese, again, this is all part of this stereotype, is that after a gold rush and the Exclusion Act, they're just gone and the story ends and they're like extinct. And that's absolutely not true. But when you hear about these myths of the underground cities, you know, where the Chinese lived in tunnels and stuff, most of that is myth, but it's a metaphor, like the Underground Railroad. A lot of this population was driven underground because of these laws, and so they aren't as present in the documentary record, even though if you really look for where a lot of these folks went, they're still there. A lot of their descendants are here today, you know, so.
Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening, and please give a round of applause for Briece, Kelsey, and Mark. Thank you very much. Much, much more could have been told to you, right?
That was a